Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Azim Premji University. We are delighted to present today's program in our series of public lectures, which are held at our two campus cities, here in Bangalore and Bhopal every month. Public lectures are one of the ways by which the Azim Premji Foundation promotes its vision. All our public lectures, close to 100 so far, are available on our YouTube channel, and I invite you to view them. A brief introduction to the speaker, the interlocutor, and the topic. Professor Amita Bhaviskar's CV was part of the invitation, so I'll only pick the highlights. Amita Bhaviskar is Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Ashoka University. She is renowned for her groundbreaking work on India's cultural politics of environment and development. Among other things, she studies Delhi's air pollution and heat experiences. Author of In the Belly of the River and Uncivil City, Bhaviskar has been instrumental in shaping environmental sociology and the study of social movements in India. She holds a PhD in development sociology from Cornell and has received several awards, among them the Infosys Prize for Social Sciences, the V.K.R. Rao Prize, and the Malcolm Adisheshaya Award. Our public lectures follow a format where we have the speaker deliver their talk, and then one of my colleagues from the university engages the speaker in a short conversation. Today it will be P.S. Narayan, PSN as he is more widely known. PSN is the global head of sustainability at Wipro, and his interests center around the broad interplay between ecology, economics, and humanities, and two, sustainable and inclusive cities. A bit about the program this evening. Soon after this introduction, Amita will deliver her talk for about 45-50 minutes. PSN will then be in conversation with her for about 20 minutes. And at the end, we expect to have around 15 minutes for audience questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Amita Bhaviskar.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much to the Azim Premji Foundation and University for inviting me. I've long been an admirer of the university and all that it stands for, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. We live in the Anthropocene. Has everyone here heard that word somewhere? Yes. And the Anthropocene is a new geological epoch in which human actions have profoundly changed the Earth, its ecosystems, and its climate. Much of that change in climate, we know, is caused by global warming, as greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, as well as methane, nitrous oxides, synthetic fluorinated gases, all of these accumulate in the atmosphere and trap heat. And you will probably also know that the term Anthropocene itself has been challenged because it seems to suggest that anthropos, all of humanity, is somehow responsible for this crisis. But we know that that's not so. The power to consume resources, the power to create emissions has varied a lot over time and across space. And political and economic inequalities created by colonialism and capitalism have defined who pollutes and who pays the price. So a number of scholars suggest that rather than talking about the Anthropocene, we should be talking about the Capitalocene, because it is that period of capitalist production really taking off with industrialization, but seriously leaping forth in the 1950s what has been called the Great Acceleration, when increasing rates of burning coal and oil and petroleum and natural gas have ended up making the planet hotter. We know that warmer air, warmer oceans, and lands together create longer and hotter heat waves, more frequent droughts and wildfires, heavier rainfall, and more powerful storms. So these severe forces of weather, what gets called the elements, heat and wind and cold and rain, they've always been with us. So there's nothing particularly novel or surprising about them. But to use the word the elements rather than to use the word weather suggests that they have some power, they have agency. These are extreme forces, the elements, that must be endured. And it is the agency of wind and cold and heat and rain as it works with as well as against humans, other living beings, and non-living elements. That's the subject of my talk today. How are the elements experienced by different people? How have these experiences changed because of global warming? And what do these changes tell us about how people imagine themselves and how they live their lives? So, in my current work, I'm focusing on three elements: heat and dust and rain. And today I'm going to talk about dust, which I think living in Bangalore, as most of you do, you are spared the worst of it. But I'll explain why this is such an important topic for those of us who live and work in North Indian plains. So, thinking about the Anthropocene, thinking about climate change, you may well ask, what does a sociologist, anthropologist have to say about a subject such as this? Surely it's a field for scientific experts and policymakers. So, my work is informed by scientific data and about biophysical processes, about identifying and measuring emissions, about epidemiology and disease. However, just as the biophysical scientists seek to fine-tune their models and measurements, I try and provide a fine-grained analysis of how climate is understood, experienced, and acted upon by differently situated people with their strengths and their vulnerabilities. And most of this research is based on extended interviews and participant observation, which is what anthropologists and sociologists normally do. And I draw on a very broad analytical frame, one that combines political ecology with the anthropology of the senses. And I try and look at the entanglements created by the interdependence between different social groups, species, and the non-living world. All of this may sound very abstract, but I hope as I go forward, some of this will get fleshed out. And this is work in progress. So your comments, your criticism, your suggestions, your observations would be really useful and important for me. This topic of dust, air pollution, and Indian cities is huge, and I'm only going to talk about a very small slice of it, and that is urban North India, especially the metropolis of Delhi, where I live. Each place, as we know, is particular. It has its own specificities, and great global forces may affect each place, but always in ways that are distinctively local and conjunctural, tangled in very specific histories and geographies. Delhi is not Bangalore, Delhi is not even Lucknow, Lucknow is not Guwahati, etc. So I do not attempt to generalize, but I do hope that you will find evidence here and arguments that resonate with other places and peoples, with things that you also care about and want to make a difference for. One last caveat. The topic of air pollution is something that cries out for urgent public action. We need much more analysis, investigation, and mobilization, especially on the ground among the most vulnerable social groups. We need to speak truth to power. Of course we do. But in this talk, I'm going to set aside that question of what is to be done and instead focus on what is, what was, and how people are making sense of these changes. So as I said earlier, I'm studying three elements: heat, dust, and rain. And in my work on heat, I've looked at how the cultural experience of heat has changed across society as global warming has interacted with Delhi's pollution and patterns of work, housing, and travel, and with cooling technologies, and this is really the big thing that's changed all our lives, air conditioning. Right now we're in Bangalore, a city that used to be called the air-conditioned city, and we're in an artificially air-conditioned space. So this has happened fairly recently in the city's history. And I argue that these kinds of dynamic factors, how we build, how we live, our sense of comfort, these are all sort of nestled within each other. And they create new lifestyles and as well as habits of body and mind. And by habits of body and mind, I mean a sense of thermal comfort, where we feel that if you're not in an air-conditioned space, you're physically uncomfortable. But in creating cool, peaceful havens for ourselves, that is the well-to-do, we also end up creating new inequalities, new vulnerabilities. As you can see, all the exhausts thrown out of these air conditioners is making life a lot harder for people who live and walk and travel on the streets. And of course, all of that power for the air conditioners, which is everybody who owns an air conditioner knows, is the most expensive electrical appliance that you can have. All of this also means that electricity is coming from somewhere, and that power is usually generated in far-off places, feeding really vicious circles of environmental exploitation and ecological distress. So when we pick up the air conditioner's remote and we press a button to switch it on, these are not images that come into our minds because we have distanced ourselves from the sources that light up and cool our lives. But they're very real and they're very difficult for the people who have to deal with them. But this is the vicious circle, right? The more we burn in order to keep ourselves cool, the more the planet heats up. And exhaust heat from air conditioners for some privileged people intensifies the urban heat island effect for everyone else. It accelerates coal mining for thermal power plants and contributes further to global warming. As a counterpoint, what I've been looking at also in my work are older and still practiced modes of thinking and living with heat, which conceive of a more harmonious relationship between the body and its environment. Often these are Ayurvedic principles of being in balance, in tune with through your diet, through your living practices, with the environment around you. And this involves people submitting to the rules of the season. If it is summer, you do this. If it is winter, you do this. A mode of engagement with nature that contrasts with the totalizing and sequestration offered by air conditioning. So, just like heat, dust is another everyday element of life in Delhi that has been rendered strange by the same forces that have led to climate change. Where does dust come from? And what does it do? And how do people deal with it? Dealing with dust is a daily mundane chore. Inside our homes, we sweep and swab, called doing jharu pocha in Delhi every day. And when I'm listening to a lecture or a discussion on Zoom, on my headphones, or talking on the phone, I wander around my flat with a damp cloth, wiping down bookshelves and tabletops, walking to the sink to rinse and repeat. When I went to study in the US as a grad student in upstate New York, I was so surprised that one didn't need to sweep and mop and dust for days at a time. There was no dust. And this was just such a surprise given what I was used to. Dust finds its way into my Delhi flat no matter whether the doors are open or shut. There's more of it in summer, especially after the short, sharp andhis or dust storms that occasionally punctuate the oppressive heat. And some of that dust has come across the sea all the way from the Arabian Peninsula to Delhi. Now, this dust is made out of particles of mineral matter about 10 microns in diameter. It's a nuisance, but it's a minor one. Far, far worse is the dust that I cannot see, that I breathe deep into my lungs, and that is slowly making me sick, and that will shorten my life. This is the dust that's the gift of the Anthropocene. Dust is born on the air. While air is a compound of different gases, as anybody who's done school-level chemistry, physics, science will know, air is also a busy medium for other things. It carries sounds to our ears and signals to our mobile phones. It carries smells by bringing molecules of volatile organic compounds to our noses. And besides dust, air carries pollen and water and viruses. So air right now in this room around us is a minestrone soup of organic and inorganic substances, dead and living matter, all bobbing along on the current. And dust itself, or dust as airborne particulate matter is nowadays referred to as PM. Dust itself is not a single thing, but it's a complex mix of many chemicals. This mix can contain aerosols composed of small droplets of liquid. It can contain dry solid fragments and solid cores with liquid coatings. And particles may vary widely in size, shape, and chemical composition. They can contain inorganic ions, metallic compounds, elemental carbon, organic compounds, compounds from the Earth's crust. And life in this aerosol soup is unstable. So gases can form particles. Sunlight and humidity can change the properties of these particles. Other things can modify their form and functioning. So this ever-changing character of airborne particulate matter, of dust, actually makes it particularly hard to be able to figure out what we're dealing with and how to handle it. So on the surface, dust seems, well, dust, obviously, but it's actually, as I've been finding out, incredibly complex. Now, the idea that dust or airborne particulate matter could be a pollutant and could be a civic problem needing public action emerged in Delhi in the early 1990s. Before that, dust was simply there. It was a part of life. But it becomes a problem in the public eye, and I've written in some detail about this in my book, Uncivil Cities, so I'm only going to give you the sort of broad contours of this. What happened in the 1990s in Delhi was that there was a common sense narrative that began to emerge about the problem of pollution. Newspapers began to carry stories, and this was put together not only by the media, but also by the courts and by an assertive middle class. And this narrative said Delhi is polluted because this city has a lot of industries in it. And remember that this was the decade after the Bhopal gas tragedy. So there was a lot of attention to the toxicity and the pollution from industrial plants. So the claim was that air and water in Delhi were polluted by industries, big and small, and these industries needed to be shut down or ordered to relocate outside Delhi. Delhi being the capital should not be polluted. But the unsaid part of it was, well, they can go somewhere else and they can continue to pollute there, but that doesn't matter. So this kind of dominant understanding of pollution was not altogether wrong. It is true that industries did pollute, but it was very partial. It was selective in who it chose to blame, and it was biased in what it turned a blind eye towards. So state action chose to focus on shutting down factories, even though 64% of Delhi's air pollution in 1992-93 came from motor vehicles and only 12% came from industrial sources. And the reason why the courts focused on shutting down industries was because there was a case filed by MC Mehta, an environmentalist, an activist and a lawyer, and he went before the Supreme Court, and the court issued a series of directives in the second half of the 1990s, and then that resulted in the closure of thousands of industrial units in Delhi. And the petitions and the court's actions were justified as being in the public interest. And the media, the middle class, all widely supported this environmental initiative. Affected factory owners and workers' organizations didn't succeed in getting the court to amend its decision. And as a result, not only did many small factory owners suffer significant financial losses, thousands of poor workers lost their only means of livelihood. So, 64% of the air pollution is coming from motor vehicles. But the first step is crack down on industries. So it was only after 4 years or 5 years that pollution from motor vehicles came to the court's attention. And this was thanks to a popular outreach campaign by the NGO Center for Science and Environment. They published a book in 1996 called Slow Murder, which showed that vehicular pollution was the major killer as far as Delhi's citizens were concerned. But then too, the problem was addressed selectively. So privately owned vehicles, cars, scooters, motorcycles, were exempted from action. The court's primary focus was on cutting emissions from public transport vehicles. So there was this huge shrinking of public transport because taxi owners, auto rickshaw owners found they had to change their vehicles or had to sell them altogether. CNG was in short supply, and even though everybody is supposed to use it. And so the biggest effects were on those who actually ran the public transport system, as well as, of course, working class commuters. Whereas those who had access to private means, affluent commuters, they went unscathed. And partly because public transport became that much harder to access, the number of private vehicles also continued to rise, and they rose unchecked because there were no curbs at all by the courts on that source of pollution. So one can see here that people appeal to the courts in the name of public interest, but the consequences of those actions are sharply divided. So this pursuit of public interest deprived a large section of Delhi's working class of their means of subsistence. Presumed environmental benefits, cleaner air and water, were obtained at the cost of losing working environments, resources that provided livelihoods to some of the poorest and most vulnerable citizens of the city. So how did elites succeed in presenting environmental hazard and spatial order as concerns that superseded the welfare of Delhi's working class? How did the priorities of workers, such as jobs, food, and shelter, come to be overlooked? Why were affected workers not represented in the decision-making process? Why is it that action was routed through the courts when the Indian government actually has an extensive administrative setup for monitoring and regulating pollution. Was closing down factories the most effective way of improving air quality? So, none of these issues got addressed or even spoken about. And this silence about key questions, as well as the strategic appeal to courts rather than broader debate and mobilization in the public sphere, tells us something about the character of public action and indeed the public sphere at that time in the 1990s, because we're talking about the larger climate of liberalization, where environmental initiatives came to be detached from the principles of social justice. So, what used to be a really vibrant set of social movements around environmental action gradually became smaller, the space for them shrunk, and what we saw was the rise of action rooted through the courts that shunned any kind of collective mobilization, and that also primarily worked through the media. So the context in which the court acted against air pollution was that of liberalization, and it's also significant that the real estate market opened up as private developers found that the land on which the larger factories stood became more valuable than ever. This is something that has happened not just in Delhi, but also in Mumbai, where the old textile mills, which were at least a third of that land in the center, in the heart of Mumbai, which was to be converted to green areas and public spaces, has all been developed privately for new forms of consumption, new office spaces, new commercial real estate. So this is the time in the 1990s when Delhi's production economy was also shifting from manufacturing to services and commerce. And so an industrial economy declines, and what we have is a much greater reliance on informal labor, ill-paid workers without any job security, who live in illegal shanty settlements in the city, who are often migrants, and they are denied recognition as legitimate citizens. So, connecting these processes, these practices and positions allows us to see how the city became a place where public interest could be defined in a way that the problem of air pollution could be addressed in ways that completely left out working class interests and aspirations. And it's this convergence and the exclusions that it creates, liberalization, the rise of middle class, the anxiety and concerns around controlling social spaces and sanitizing them, that I call bourgeois environmentalism, where elite interests are disguised as public interest, and the media and the courts support them. And this environmentalism has little to do with ecological sustainability and more to do with creating a social and spatial order. So this problem of air pollution then conjures up a cause and a constituency. It authorizes actions, and it eliminates and it enables exclusions, obscures as much as it reveals. So there is no sort of natural progression here between a problem arising and the growth of collective concern. If there had been such a straightforward link between air pollution and public action, we would not be at the pass at which we find ourselves today, where despite being one of the most polluted cities in the world, there's just no commensurate sense of urgency or resolve to take on the issue. So let me jump forward 20 years into the present, where the problem of air pollution has been relentlessly on the rise, and the city is firmly established as the most polluted capital city in the world. On Delhi's AQI index, air quality index, a composite of the incidence of different gases and particles, a score of 100 and below is called satisfactory. Note that the AQI in India has lower values for what is considered clean air compared to, say, the United States. Before the pandemic and the lockdown, Delhi had no good air days in 2019. Not a single day in the year when the AQI fell below 50. And there were only 54 days of satisfactory air, AQI between 51 to 100. In the month of October, when people celebrate Diwali, despite court-ordered bans against bursting crackers, the AQI goes beyond 999. The sensors don't have 4 things to record the digits, literally off the charts. The air is murky, it is laced with a charred smell. And this is a world away from the skies I remember from September, October in the 1980s, even in early 1990s, when the monsoons would wash away all the suspended dust from the air, from the trees, leaving behind a deep blue firmament. October is now the season when the media and the government stage a by now familiar blame game. We have just been through one round of it, because they say that air pollution is caused not in Delhi, but in the surrounding countryside where farmers set fire to stubble in their fields. Smoke from their smoldering fields drifts into Delhi, creating the gas chamber effect that lasts for 2 to 3 weeks. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to discuss this phenomenon, since like the coal mining I'd mentioned briefly earlier, it has a bearing on how the urban and the rural actually shape each other. So the practice of farmers in northwest India, in the states of Punjab and Haryana and western UP, of burning the residue of the rice or paddy crop is a relatively new practice. And it's been adopted since combine harvesters were introduced to speedily cut up the paddy so that farmers could sow the winter crop in time. Mechanical harvesting leaves a taller residue than the more time-consuming process of scything by hand. And this stubble, because it's taller, is difficult to plow in and must therefore be burnt. Now, the reason why farmers are in a rush to burn it is because they've been banned from planting paddy early in the summer. Why can't they plant paddy early in the summer? Because there's a law that says that this practice is depleting the groundwater. So there's a ban on early planting of paddy in the summer months in North India. So farmers can only plant when the monsoons start. And because they therefore start later, their crop cycle tends to also end later as well. And that the paddy eats into the time allotted for the winter wheat crop. And so they are in a hurry to harvest it as soon as possible. Thus, a policy to curb one ecological harm, namely the overuse of groundwater, has led to another, which is stubble burning and very severe air pollution. While various mechanical measures are being tried out to change harvesting practices, including something called a happy seeder, I think that's a nice name, there's not enough thought or action about getting farmers to give up this water and chemical-intensive paddy wheat cycle into which the Green Revolution has locked them. So planting legumes, pulses that is, and millets, which were monsoon season crops that used to be grown before the coming of the Green Revolution, is known to be more sustainable. But in the absence of support prices, farmers are reluctant to grow them. Thus, wheat and rice that farmers grow because of a regime of state supports, all of that makes its way to cities, part of a subsidized basic food ration provided by the public distribution system. So in a way, it's urban patterns that favor urban consumption that have created a particular predicament for farmers as well. So cheap food, depleted soils and water, and dirty air. And of course, the people who are worst affected by the dirty air are farmers and laborers who inhale that smoke directly. All of these are entangled in this particular mess. So it's easier to agree on the causes of these episodic spikes in October because that's when Delhi's characteristic climate conditions of what is called air temperature inversion and low wind speed are conducive to the smog created by firecrackers and stubble burning. But what about the rest of the year? What about all those other days across the remaining 11 months when air quality is either poor or very poor or severe or off the charts? What causes those? So, as a climate scientist explained to me, most studies of air pollution are snapshots. They don't capture the fluctuations in particular seasons and locations. And without data on what is called real-time source apportionment, different agencies and different groups will continue to deny that they are responsible. The best studies and models come up with widely divergent findings because they use different assumptions, methods, instruments, and the difficulties and disagreements stem in large part also from the protean quality of aerosols, the elusive, shape-shifting nature of the particles themselves, their fast-fading signatures that are so hard to capture. What gases and particulate matter does a wood-burning cook stove release? How is exhaust from a petrol engine or on a motorcycle different from what comes out of the tailpipe of a diesel truck? What exactly is emitted from the chimneys of a thermal power plant and how does it get dispersed? And to complicate matters, PM or particulate matter may be either directly emitted from these sources, this is called primary particles, or it may be formed in the atmosphere through chemical reactions of gases, such as sulfur dioxide or nitrogen oxide and certain organic compounds. So measuring and attributing is so tricky that it's enabled an endless twiddling of thumbs. We don't know, so we can't do anything. We must put in more. So all the money that's spent is mainly spent on monitoring and measuring, not on trying to fix the problem. The principle of that fairness, the principle of fairness, that responsibility must be fixed accurately so that the correctly identified polluter must pay, overrides any other notion of fairness. One that would insist that if people are falling sick and dying, surely sweeping measures should be taken to curb pollution. But once again, we see there are double standards at work. Now, the same deliberate dithering marks any discussion of how air pollution affects people's health. So, we talked about PM 2.5 earlier, and these are particles whose diameter is smaller than 2.5 microns, and they're mainly produced by burning fossil fuels and wood. They're a subset of PM10, or particles less than 10 microns in size, which also includes wind-blown dust from open lands, dust from construction sites and landfills, wildfires and waste burning. Also pollen and fragments of bacteria. But both PM 2.5 and PM 10 can be inhaled, but because of its tiny size, PM 2.5 is more likely to travel into and settle deeper inside the lungs, while PM 10 is more likely to deposit itself on the surfaces of the larger airways of the upper regions of the lungs. Now, both sets of particles can induce tissue damage and lung inflammation. But research points out that older adults with chronic heart or lung, with chronic heart or lung disease, children and asthmatics as a group are more likely to experience adverse health effects. Also, children and infants are more susceptible to harm from inhaling pollutants such as particulate matter because children inhale more air per pound of body weight than do adults. they breathe faster, they spend more time outdoors, and they have smaller body sizes. In addition, their immature immune systems may cause them to be more susceptible to PM than healthy adults. And research in the US has shown that children living in communities with high levels of PM 2.5 had slower lung growth and had smaller lungs at age 18 compared to children who lived in communities with low PM 2.5 levels. However, the Indian government denies that studies done elsewhere apply to India. They have actually insisted officially that there's something called the Indian lung, an Indian lung that is more resistant because it has been dealing with more shit for a longer time. However, the research that is coming out of India shows even more serious impacts. If a pregnant woman is exposed to air pollution, the chances of fetal distress, stillbirth, and low birth weight go up. If the baby survives, she's likely to be small for her age, what's called stunted, and she's likely to weigh less, what's called wasted. This growing child's cognitive development can be delayed and impaired. This child will suffer more acute respiratory infections. She will be anemic. She is more likely to die in infancy. The public health modeling expert I spoke to was careful to point out that every disease is a manifestation of multiple biological and environmental factors. It's hard to separate them, especially when the sources of particulate matter are so hard to pinpoint. So this job of saying air pollution kills X is really hard to actually pinpoint. So what is also hard to understand and what is very poorly understood are the multiple biological pathways through which particulate matter travels in the body, the kinds of effects that it has. So from the air into the lungs, into the blood, into even the brain, what dust does to the body is becoming more evident, but how it does so is barely understood. And if it is difficult to identify the sources of air pollution, it is even more difficult to disaggregate the effects of poverty, of malnutrition, and air pollution acting together. I've always been a bit puzzled by this drive to parse out impacts. It seems such a reductionist exercise. Surely the point is that these factors work together. Their sum of human misery is greater than the parts. Should we not understand exposure and vulnerability as the accumulation of disadvantage? Of all the people pictured here, who is already burdened with malnourishment? Who must put their bodies in harm's way to cook their food, to stay warm, to make a living? Who must live with dust and deal with its deadly toll? Well-to-do people in Delhi are well up on the vocabulary of AQI and PM 2.5. They suffer too, but they have access to safer spaces, sequestered with ACs and air purifiers. They have access to the best medical care. And it's now the done thing to travel out of Delhi on Diwali, extending the time-tested strategy of going to hill stations to escape the heat. Or they buy houseplants. And for some totally puzzling reason, a lot of these advertisements for houseplants say that they are NASA certified. I have no idea why the US Space Agency is interested in certifying houseplants, but there you are. And the sale of these houseplants shot up during the pandemic because purportedly they purify the air. So elites escape even though their vehicles and their use of power is disproportionately responsible for the crisis that is air pollution. So let me end with an asthma story. 4 years ago, I was part of a study to find out how adolescents with asthma coped with air pollution and their illness. So to recruit subjects for the study, we went to an East Delhi neighborhood, which was a major center for recycling solid waste. The area was congested and dirty, heaps of scrap lay out in the open, ready for sorting. Small workshops ground plastics into pellets for recycling. A major highway ran alongside. So, with the help of a waste workers NGO that ran an after-school program in the area, we asked a group of children if any of them had difficulty breathing. And all of them shook their heads. No, they got out of breath when playing running games, but that was it. Meanwhile, one of the researchers in my team, who was asthmatic herself, was puffing on her inhaler, unable to cope with the dirty air. So the children looked at her pityingly and they said, yes, the air is bad, but it doesn't affect us. We've grown up in it. Our bodies are used to it. And this really puzzled us because that's not how pollution works. Exposure isn't supposed to give you immunity, even though that's also what the Indian government believes. Exposure makes you ill. So when we visited a child's home, her mother said to us, there's nothing wrong with my son. He gets coughs and colds every now and then, but I'm the one you should take to the hospital. And this woman said she suffered from chest pains, but she hadn't seen a doctor. Why? Well, if I went to the government hospital, I'd have to take a day off from work, and I wouldn't earn that day. And if I went to the private clinic in our neighborhood, the doctor would ask for x-rays and blood tests, and I don't have the money for those, or for the fees and the medicines. So she and others in her circumstances would only seek medical health if they were desperate, if their illness stopped them from working, and they would go on putting one foot before the other to earn a living and run a household, no matter whether they had a fever or their bodies were aching or whatever. So since we couldn't find any children with asthmatic symptoms in the community, we went to the big government-run children's hospital that served the area. And they had an asthma clinic, and the doctors were willing to let us approach the patients who came once a week to be tested and to refill their inhalers. Here, finally, were the asthmatic adolescents we had been searching for. However, our study was designed to include an equal number of boys and girls in the sample. At the hospital, waiting for their turn, we found only boys. So where were the girls? The doctor said parents don't bring girls. So what happens to the girls? How do they cope with asthma? An uncomfortable silence followed. And later, piecing it together, we figured out that little girls with asthma don't get treated because their parents don't or can't spend the money or the time in dealing with their condition. So they die early, quietly, at home. But boys are different. Boys are worth looking after. They're worth taking a day off from work to go to hospital. They're worth spending money. So parents decide who to take care of, girls or boys. And you can just imagine how difficult these choices are for the people who make them. And these are the choices that are forced on them by poverty, by malnutrition, and air pollution altogether. A brief side note before I end. So most working class people attributed respiratory illness not to pollution, but to hawa pani, to air and water. But, not to pollution, not to hawa pani, not to air and water, but to the declining quality of food. They said they use too many chemicals these days. They put too much dawai in the fields to grow food. Desi organic food would clean the blood. Nothing is pure anymore. That's why we've lost our immunity. So there's also this understanding of immunity and quality of food, etc., that's very powerful in how people relate to their bodies and to sickness that's around them. And A.K. Ramanujam, the renowned poet and scholar, interpreted a verse from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is a 16th century BC Vedic text, a verse that is still chanted by Orthodox upper caste Hindus before beginning a meal. And the verse begins with the phrase, Annam Brahma. Food is God. Food is the creator. And Ramanujam observes that food is Brahman, because food is what circulates in the universe through bodies, which in turn are food made flesh and bone. According to this view, in the organic world, there is no other stuff. Food is the primal substance. All animate beings are its forms. One may stretch it further, he says, and see the cycle as embracing inorganic matter as well. All forms arise out of food and return to it. Inorganic becomes organic. The eater is eaten. Big fish eat little fish. And if you wait long enough, little fish eat big fish. Unquote. Or, as the Anglican Church's Book of Common Prayer says when burying the dead, rather dryly, I think, we therefore commit this body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So both the Taittiriya Upanishad and the Book of Common Prayer for Anglicans thinks of life as a circle, life on earth as a circle that is completed. Think of this circle of life, eating food and being eaten, dust to dust, as urban metabolism, the sum total of the technical and socio-economic processes that occur in cities, resulting in growth, the production of energy, and elimination of waste. The idea of urban metabolism has helped illuminate material flows, especially those of solid waste in the city, in the global south. Its mountains of discarded plastic, metal, glass, and paper. Value that is extracted, consumed, and thrown away is retrieved and recycled and salvaged, ironically by those very social groups who are themselves regarded by others as detritus, as the dregs of society, as waste. The idea of urban metabolism draws on what John Bellamy Foster has called the metabolic drift, Karl Marx's notion of a growing rupture in the dynamic exchange between laboring humans and the rest of nature, emanating from capitalist agricultural production and the growing division between town and country, a rupture that takes capitalism towards crisis. In Marx's work, industrial agriculture so depleted the soil that its continuation required extracting bones from graveyards and guano from distant colonies as synthetic fertilizers to bring to Europe. These global circuits of moving resources in are accompanied by moving waste out. Western Europe solved its acid rain problem by outsourcing polluting manufacturing industries to East and Southeast Asia. Which bodies shall live and breathe clean air, and which bodies shall be allowed to die? These are the key questions that lie at the bottom of the circle of life and this movement from dust to dust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Amita, for unraveling layer after layer of a problem that we experience only partially, because we belong to the class which don't experience it directly, but we read about a lot. And I think today what you spoke about, I think, illuminated so many dark spots of this whole picture that, we can't wait to hear more. I'm going to start by referring to a recent report from the Center for Social for CSC, in October, which effectively says that at least this year, the contribution of stubble burning is less than 5% to Delhi's AQI. And a significant part is actually from vehicular pollution, right? So in some ways, therefore, bringing back, sent right into, focus that the fact that the large part of the problem is within the city and is because of what you said, of the use of private transport. I want to ask you this when you spoke about bourgeois environmentalism. In the discourse on sources of air pollution in a city like Delhi, do they really go deep into these things which are really fair and square on account of private consumption?
The short answer is they don't.
Yeah.
And the reason they don't is because our economy is built around trying to get people to consume as much as possible, provided they can afford it. And we know that the number of vehicles in all Indian cities or across, in fact, even in rural areas, increased hugely once liberalization started, because you could now afford to buy a vehicle much more quickly. It had become relatively cheap. It had become affordable in EMIs. And so if you look at the importance of the automobile industry in powering India's growth since the 1990s, it's huge. It's a very powerful industrial body, and it has for the longest time sat on the very boards and commissions. Before we had the new clean air body, after the legislation was passed a few years ago, in the previous body, you had a representative from SIAM, from the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, sitting there. So what measures can you seriously take? That's from the side of the producers and the power of particular industries in shaping what can or cannot be done to curb environmental pollution. At a broader level, we also know that in the last decade or so, whatever little environmental regulation that we had has in fact been loosened and weakened. And again, that's happened because of industry complaining to government saying, you're not letting us mine or put up industries or do a whole lot of other environmentally very drastic things quickly enough. So in a larger context, environmental regulations are being loosened, and consumption is going up, partly because there's much less regulation of the economy. Second, also because the way in which we're all seduced into personal consumption choices, and the political philosopher Sudhir Chellarajan at IT Madras has said that we have a toxic enchantment around the automobile, that we know that that's the worst sort of thing to drive around in and to navigate urban spaces. But the car is so caught up in our ideas of freedom. And I know this particularly as a woman, because for the longest time, the ability, before you had Uber and all the rest of it, before you had the metro, my ability to stay out and move about in the city at night safely was because I drove. So one can see that these are not difficult, these are difficult things to untangle. How our aspirations or ideas of comfort become oriented so that certain things appear to be the only solution. So that's why I think unraveling the little bits that go into presenting something as there is no alternative is a very important job to do, so that we can see the kinds of steps we've taken along the way.
Sure. And I think one of the conundrums which strikes us when you look at the Delhi example of public transport, especially the metro, the usage of it, which is very high. But even in cities like Bombay and Bangalore, while on one hand, the usage of the metro in Delhi is an upward graph, but there is a concomitant increase of much greater proportion in the use of private vehicles. Right, so that's another conundrum, and probably that has got to do with what you said, that it's part of our aspirational consciousness that uh, you think that even if there's an option like the metro, which is there available, which is good, you do think twice about it, about using it uh, vis-a-vis a private vehicle, which is not the case, let's say, in a city like New York or Boston or London, where people, from all classes use public transport much more freely. So, do you think that is this just a phase in our development cycle where we are stuck in this, and eventually we will see light at the end of the tunnel, where we'll have more public adoption?
Well, it's a little bit like saying that that if things get really bad, that after that sort of catastrophic moment, there might be something new that emerges. Quite frankly, I think a lot of people now take the metro, and it took the longest time for metro ridership to increase because it is much more expensive than other options like taking the bus, for instance, is to do with the fact that traffic congestion became so difficult. And that a lot of people who wouldn't have taken the metro are now starting to take it. But it was also pointed out by transport experts that you should never expect that the metro will decrease congestion. Because if there's space on the roads, people will occupy it. And that's indeed what has happened in Delhi. The metro is there, but it isn't as if people are saying, oh, today I won't, get on my bike and ride to work. Because with the metro, there's also issues, to do with last mile connectivity and so on and so forth. So I don't see it changing unless there is very drastic action from the state. And that action will only come if there's that sort of sense of political urgency, that there's something to be gained from doing this. So the odds right now, given our political economy, are stacked against this. And we know that that elites who could, in a lot of situations, help to create pressure and create a public conversation around important issues, in India have by and large abdicated that responsibility. Perhaps the nationalist movement was the last time that Indian elites of different kinds participated in progressive politics, quite frankly. You think about the state of public education, think about public health. Elites have opted out, and we see the same thing with air pollution. As long as private solutions can be found, and there are people who have the money to afford them, they're not going to worry about the common and the shared resources and infrastructure that affect the lives of everyday people.
Right. So I want to segue from that into something that you've written about, which is this question of why are environmental issues not part of electoral politics, or why are they not? Why don't they feature in election issues? Right. So I want to ask you this now. Whether it is a city like Delhi or a larger rural constituency, the vulnerable and the disenfranchised obviously constitute a significant proportion of the population. Is it fair to say this, that the reason why the poor don't engage with this is because they don't have the mental space to think about such issues, though they are exposed the most? Because for them, it's a daily struggle for survival. As you said, they can't even afford to take a day off to go to the hospital, right? And therefore, it's too much to expect them to think about these issues. I mean, 5 years reduced from your lifetime is too far away for them. For them, it's about today and tomorrow, right? And as you said, the elite anyway, have found out private solutions to this. So is that the reason why it's not an electoral issue?
That's one of the toughest questions to answer, partly because the argument that was made by scholars like Ram Guha and Madhav Gadgil, which is an argument that had a powerful force, is that in countries like India, in the global south, what you have is not an environmentalism of the rich, or what's called full stomach environmentalism, where people who have everything else become concerned about the quality of, how green areas are disappearing or how the oceans are polluted, and then become mobilized and, fight for environmental action. They said that environmental issues go to the heart of people's livelihoods, be it the women in the Himalayan foothills, part of the Chipko movement, be it people in the Narmada Valley who are fighting for the survival and of their very culture and their community. So if environmental issues are indeed fundamental to people's well-being in India, why don't they figure in the one way in which everybody acts politically, which is through exercising their franchise? I think that there's something about the framing of elections as something to do with not so much the larger policies of a government, but to do with issues like particular welfare schemes and what they will directly bring to people of a certain class. It's also to do with communitarian identities and the ways in which people see them, not necessarily only as economic subjects and citizens, but as people who belong socially and identify socially with a particular caste group or a particular religion and or ethnic group. And that then shapes their sense of what they expect from the political process, that we should be represented. And even if that representation may not necessarily bring good things their way, there's still a sense of pride that, we are being recognized. So I think what makes people vote in the ways that they do at elections is shaped by these things. And environmental causes, especially when they are seen as contrasted, or rather they're seen as countering development processes which bring jobs, then people see that as a trade-off. But the larger issue is, like you said, that people don't have the bandwidth to be able to participate in struggles. So in fact, when they do, I'm just blown away by how courageous that is, especially in today's context where, any form of criticism can land you in jail without bail. And, you can be, as a student, you can spend 10 years in jail just waiting for your case to come up on charges of whatever, terrorism, sedition, treason, you name it. So I think the political costs of environmental action or any kind of critical action have become very high, even as the larger context of liberalization has created a sense where even the smaller but with deep historical legacies, modes of mobilization through trade unions, etc., they don't have a leg to stand on anymore. So the old organized working class moment is gone. The social movements for environmental causes, for progressive things I think, has declined. So this is really the great challenge before our times. How do you muster strength and mobilize against things where you are fragmented and atomized?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to pick up with what you said, in the beginning, that the contrast between full stomach environmentalism in the West and our own movements like the Chipko and the Narmada movement, which were rooted in livelihoods. I I'm just thinking aloud. These movements were, of course, rooted in the lives and livelihoods of people around things that were probably more tangible, like the river or the forest. Air, which is a commons, whether it is in urban or rural, is invisible. You can't wrap your head around it in tangible terms. Okay. So is that one of the reasons why engagement with something like air pollution, though it directly hits livelihoods, is that much more difficult?
I think some of the most powerful movements in our times have been around God, right? Where is God? So I think so therefore I disagree with you on this point, because I think that people are capable of imagining and making real to themselves all sorts of things,
Right.
including having relationships with their ancestors,
Right.
with spirits
Right.
and deities and so on.
Right.
So that thing of what is real and what matters more, the physical, the material, the spiritual, the imaginary, is so hard to think of in our country. Take, for instance, rivers. The great cultural puzzle is that the Ganga is sacred, revered, she's mother. At the same time, the Ganga is hugely, hugely polluted. Now, either that shows you that mothers give you unconditional love, and you can sort of like shove all your muck. She's going to clean it up and not mind and forgive you, or whatever it is. But this is something that a lot of Westerners have also commented on. That what is this paradox that you keep saying Ganga Maiya, and then and she's filthy. So, So I don't have an answer.
Right. No, I don't have.
But I think that there's a way in which one should be able to mobilize people's sentiments together with scientific evidence and make it count. And the thing about air is that, I see it with little children. Their noses are running, they're coughing, they're falling ill incessantly. And it's wrenching their parents' hearts. So the parents know why it's there. It's because of air. Of course, not all. I mean, there are other people who will say, "Hamara khoon saaf nahi hai," because we're not eating the right kind of food, etc. But enough people are connecting the dots, but it's not enough to make people act. Because I think the problem is complicated.
Right.
When they impose the odd, even traffic limiting thing in Delhi, it was deeply unpopular. They thought they could reduce congestion and therefore bring down. But we have good examples from other places around the world where air pollution was controlled by,
Yes.
first of all, like Beijing.
Beijing.
Of course, everybody talks about Beijing. But there are good examples of public transport systems that work in other places. Good examples where private car ownership is seriously discouraged, and at the same time good public transport is supported. But it's not just a problem of transport. It's also a problem of how we imagine our cities as places where you can walk from home
Yes.
to work.
Yes.
Where children can go to neighborhood schools and don't have to clamber aboard school buses that are air conditioned to travel for an hour and 2 hours every day or whatever. It's about thinking about urban space in a different
Right.
way. And some of the things that people do instinctively almost, because it makes sense. We were talking about this earlier. If you look at where working class migrants come and settle in a city, they always settle near the places where they're working, because they don't want to commute, because they want to save money on living, on other kinds of living expenses. They want to save money and send it home. We should have cities where people live close to the places where they work. When commuting is such a waste of life, life is short. To spend it stuck in traffic, I mean, this is really not what we should be doing. But because our cities, in a way, grow because of pressures, say, of the economic costs of real estate development, the failure of regulation, we land ourselves in these kinds of predicaments. Living in Delhi, I commute to Sonipat, which is 26 kilometers away. I have colleagues who commute from Chennai and Kolkata. So there's something fundamentally wrong with our ideas of life that you can, the idea of commutes involve intercity travel.
That's unimaginable. Thank you very much. I think now we will open up to the floor for questions. We have about 12 minutes. Yeah, you go first. Yes, please.
It was really informative to know. I'm someone who, for the most of the time of my life, thought that stubble burning causes most of what happens in Delhi. I'm wondering if you are aware of some grassroots movements in Delhi which kind of mobilize on what he mentioned, whether people are actually even capable of thinking what is happening around them. I'm wondering if you have done some research on that, or if there's something that you can direct me to, because it's something that animates me.
Yeah. So in terms of research, that I think is really good quality, and I think the best of it is coming out of the Center for Science and Environment. For the longest time, people like Anumita Roy Chaudhary have been monitoring this, and they've been intervening in particular debates as well. Apart from that, when I think of people who are looking at the problem of air pollution by working with affected communities, Chintan, which is an organization that brings together, it's an NGO that brings together waste pickers and waste sorters. Chintan would be an organization to look at and talk to. There's also it's actually an online organization, but with strong roots in Delhi, a group called Teachers Against Climate Change, which has a number of people who work on not just climate change, but related issues like air pollution. And they have been trying to put together resources for teaching about air pollution and about climate change, as well as putting together sort of a manifesto on what needs to be done. And so they go into not just the big picture analysis, but also into technical details about, well, if you decide that Delhi's energy is not going to come from coal-fired power plants, from thermal power plants, where is it going to come from? And the larger issues about urban design and planning, which are to do with the things we talked about last, about travel and commuting and things like that. There are other... I think if you type Google clean air, you'll find there's youth for clean air. I was about to say youth against clean air, but there's a lot of such organizations. I'm not quite sure exactly what they do, but the ones that I mentioned, I know their work and I know it's really good. Yeah.
Yes, you are the back. Yes. Also, please introduce yourself shortly. I'll leave it.
Well, if you just tell your name,
Just
it
your
would
name
be
and
nice.
My name is Rito Chatterjee. I'm a struggling author at the moment. So,
We're all struggling authors, believe me. Anybody who tries to write struggles.
okay,
But this is said in solidarity. Okay.
right. Okay, so when you talked about these, like these children who are born, who are born sickly, like smaller and had like health problems, needed like organ transplant, it reminded me of three different things. One is this, I don't know if you've heard of the Minamata incident in Japan, mercury poisoning. Like it people started showing symptoms of birth defects and cancer and like organ failure and nerve damage, things like that. Others like the other one is like Vietnam's Agent Orange babies, and like the things that Rachel Carson observed in a book Silent Springs, that like birds were laying like thinner eggs and animals were losing limbs and stuff. So I mean, my question is like these people exposed to these like SPM and like particulate matter who are constantly breathing in this stuff, as you showed in the slide, like. I mean, are there like, is there evidence that like people who breathe, I've heard like breathing Delhi's air is like breathing 100 like cigarettes a day. Like, I actually have a relative who has like, who lives in Delhi, has like 2 kidney transplants because of this. So like, what are the long-term health effects of like, is it like genetic mutation, cancer, organ damage? Can you just elaborate on the breathing in particular, these?
Yeah. So, I'm not an expert, but whatever studies that I have seen are mainly to do with, first of all, breathing difficulties, right? Because that's where the dust first goes in. And then the other stuff is about where really fine particles can travel. And if it goes into your bloodstream, if it even, goes through the blood-brain barrier, then you have different sorts of things happening. I don't think anybody has talked about cancers. I don't think anybody's talked about genetic mutations, because these are not chemicals in that sense, but there are probably plenty of other things in our environment that are disrupting other physiological systems. So we know, for instance, that the incidence of, polycystic ovarian, what is this disorder, PCOD, seems to have gone up hugely. And that's probably to do with other sorts of things, other chemicals that are around us in all the things that we use, our domestic appliances, our cleaning agents, all the plastics that are around us, that in different forms. But more specifically, there's a very hard-hitting study recently that came out in the New York Times that corroborated what had been said by residents and by environmental activists in Southeast Delhi for a long time. And that's to do with a waste incineration plant, and specifically the smoke coming out of there, because that smoke is laced with dioxins. And dioxins are capable of doing the kind of damage that you're talking about. So, again, it's very hard to pinpoint these things, to be able to rule out the effects of other kinds of possible causes, and to say that it is this particular form of smoke, dust, these chemicals that are causing something. But, we live in a country where there are 1,000 calamities happening always around us. I think that's the kind of thing you were also saying, that in these multitudes of catastrophes, how do you pinpoint air pollution as being important? Why don't you pick on something else? Why don't you pick on malnourishment? Just as, or as other people have done on sanitation, and the way in which lack of access to sanitation affects all of those things that I talked about. How children will grow, whether they're going to be bright and playful, or whether they're going to be skinny and slow to move. So all of these things are connected, and like I said, everything that we talk about is always going to be partial. So I think you have to put together this piece with other pieces and see how they come together.
The lady.
Hi. Thank you so much for the really interesting talk. My name is Tanvi, and I'm a PhD student studying groundwater from a political ecology and STS perspective. So, a lot of what you said resonated with me in the groundwater context. And my question kind of builds on what you just said about partial perspectives. And I was struck by the part of your talk where you were talking about how complex it is to understand air pollutants because also of how they change and how diverse they are. And it's similar in the case of groundwater studies, where it's very difficult to really understand what is happening. There's a lot of invisibility in that sense. And when then knowledge is partial, to what extent do you think it makes sense to kind of investigate it further? How, is it possible really to get to a material basis? And where do you stop trying to get to that material basis and think about larger questions, perhaps about the politics of the science or the politics of what happens from the science? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, wow, that's a difficult question because, as you know, sometimes the urgency of needing to act forces our hands a bit. And, it's a cliche now, but the Chinese ideograph for crisis is also something that means opportunity. So whenever there's a crisis, be it air pollution or with groundwater, somebody is going to make money out of it. Somebody is going to make, political capital out of it. But I think that since we can never reach a position of knowing anything fully, we always operate with provisional understandings. And if we're open to the way in which the effects of our provisional understandings can be corrected by what we come to know subsequently, then I think that is the only way forward, to keep, trying to the best of one's ability and to be, willing to pay attention to criticism and problems and try and incorporate that. But there's never going to be a moment where we're going to know everything. The main thing is to talk to as many people as possible, take on board as many points of views as possible, but also know to some extent where they're coming from, what should be dismissed and disregarded, and what one should, hold on to and press ahead with. I'm sorry, that sounds very sort of rough and ready, but I think a lot of things in life have to be tentative and approximate in that way.
I know there were at least 2 more raised hands, but I think we've run out of time. It's 8 o'clock, so we have to respect that. Okay, so we'll take 2 questions together, and then after that we can continue outside, the conversation. So maybe you and you, yes.
Just before you start, sir.
Yes.
I have an important announcement to make. If you're the owner of a Honda 1920, is the owner of the Honda 1920 in this room?
Yeah, first you
Hello,
and then you.
Amita.
Yeah.
Hi, Jay.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So I had a question about why is it so difficult for this to become a political issue? I mean, it's obvious that air pollution is bad, right? I mean, you don't have to worry about the scientific explanation for birth defects and things like that. I mean, it's obvious that it's really bad, and in Delhi, the situation is so bad in winter that it's evident to everybody who visits the city or lives in the city. So then, why can't that become an issue for political action?
Okay, thank you. Yes, you. Somebody raise your hand. Okay, all right.
Good evening, Professor Bhaviskar. I am Dipanvita. I am pursuing my PhD from Institute of Social and Economic Change. My research is also on urban environmental governance. I'm looking at air pollution and urban greening together. So I'm in a very preliminary stage of my investigation. Our environmental concerns are many, like air pollution, water pollution, solid waste management, etc., etc. when it comes to issues like, say, for example, waste disposal, we can still see some kind of social movement with respect to it. But when it comes to air pollution, do you feel, have you ever felt that there is a certain kind of apathy towards it, and especially urban apathy towards it? Thank you.
In some way, the two questions are relatable.
Yeah.
Why is it not?
Well, one, why is there no action? Second, is there apathy? I think the apathy is episodic. So, last month everybody was charged up. October, November, it's the main thing that people talk about, the media cycle, air pollution. You know that number of reports is going to spike just as the air pollution spikes. People care, but as we were discussing earlier, there are also other things people care about also, and some of those things have priority. But that's the simplest kind of answer. The more complex answer, and that's what I would say also to you, Jay, is that there are certain sorts of things we are historically not inclined to mobilize for, either because we believe this is the government's job, let them do it, or that we're taught to believe that there are other things that are more important that we should focus on. And if we look at the political environment in this country today, it's very clear that there's a huge amount of interest in issues like finding old temples, which was not the issue you would imagine would be the top of anybody's agenda 30, 40 years ago. At the same time, I think what issues matter to people are very much also shaped by ideas of their own identity as members of collectives. A lot of people may think that the air pollution situation is terrible. They also feel helpless. What can I do? So you buy an air purifier. So why is it that we come up with individualized solutions which are based on the use of certain technologies that somebody profits off, rather than think of ourselves as citizens engaged in a common enterprise, which is that of making a city that we love livable? Why is it that we don't think of ourselves as citizens first rather than as individuals? So I think there are all of those kinds of reasons of why our imagination of ourselves and of ourselves as part of a collectivity, these things have become transformed greatly. So the larger political context also has to be understood and has to be acted against. And historically, India's progressive politics has also been hostile to the environmental question. I mean, I remember people from the CPI saying, oh, but the Narmada Dam must be built, because otherwise how will the country develop? So there is also that even if you look at the legacy of progressive movements, many of them have been silent on, for instance, the gender question. Saying you first solve class. Once you solve class, other things are taken care of. But we know that that's not the case. So these are all the sorts of strands that go into it, right? The legacies of political action that we have inherited, the kinds of identities we inhabit and make for ourselves, the larger sense of seeing collectivities and the opportunities for political action that exist in this particular political moment with its own ideological, wars taking place. I hope that answers the question for both of you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think on that note, we will have to end. I really cannot thank you enough for bringing in a multitude of perspectives, the science, the sociological, the anthropological, and the human elements into something that we all experience and talk about, but still seems such a conundrum, which is urban air pollution. I cannot help ending on this note. I did read in your book Answerable City, and it's true to some extent. One of the ironies of something like pollutants is that it actually cools the atmosphere a little. So if air pollution disappears tomorrow, Delhi will become that much hotter. Okay, so because it reflects some of the heat back, right? So a blessing, a very, very small blessing in disguise of air pollution is that Delhi is not hotter than what it already is. Silver lining, silver lining. But I must, okay, let me just end with another something to do with the theme of your talk, Dust to Dust. For those of you who are cricket fans, especially from the 70s, there was a time when Australia was, the dominant country in the world. Even after that also, but in the mid 70s, there was a famous fast bowling pair, Dennis Lillee and Jeff Thompson, who just made short work of every other country. So during the 74-75 Ashes series against England, when England was just being decimated, there was a crowd chant that became iconic, which went like this. It was the Ashes series. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If Lily don't get you, Thomo must. Okay, so I can paraphrase that between this heat and this. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If heat don't get you, dust must. Okay, thank you very much.